everyone, and welcome to this deep dive into the life of, well, a man whose name is practically synonymous with the word traitor.
Benedict Arnold.
Yeah, Benedict Arnold. We're using an episode of the American History Tellers podcast as our main source. And, well, it's a wild ride, let me tell you.
It is.
But what's really fascinating to me is that this deep dive isn't just about, like, reciting the facts. We're going to tackle the big question.
Right.
Was Arnold truly a villain, or did circumstances push him to make choices that would, brand him a traitor for all these centuries?
Yeah, it's a question that historians still debate to this day, and the answer, as you'll see, is far from simple. To really understand how someone could go from, a celebrated war hero to the ultimate symbol of betrayal.
Right.
When you start at the very beginning.
Okay, so rewind to 1741.
Right.
Benedict Arnold is born in Norwich, Connecticut, to a family that's pretty prominent, at the time.
Yeah, his great-grandfather was one of the founders of Rhode Island.
Wow.
And his father was a successful sea captain and merchant. So you can already see the seeds of ambition being planted, right?
Absolutely. But the podcast makes it clear that Arnold's early life wasn't all smooth sailing when he was just 12 years old. Tragedy struck. A diphtheria epidemic swept through Norwich.
Oh, wow.
And he lost 2 of his sisters.
Oh, that's heartbreaking. And it didn't stop there. His father turned to drinking. The family business suffered. They even faced bankruptcy. They couldn't even afford to keep him in his private school anymore. Talk about a fall from grace. Do you think this is where that deep desire to reclaim honor and status really took root?
It's certainly possible the podcast emphasizes how these early experiences, the loss, the whispers of their family's decline must have been devastating for a young, ambitious boy like Arnold. This wasn't just about material wealth. It was about social standing respect, a sense of belonging in the upper echelons of colonial society.
Right. Yeah, it's almost like you can draw a line from these early struggles to his later ambition, both on the battlefield and in his personal life.
Exactly. And even as a child, you can see glimpses of the man he would become. The podcast describes him as brave, a bit of a rabble-rouser, always defending younger boys from bullies.
So those leadership qualities, the willingness to stand up for what he believed in, even if it meant going against the grain, those were there from the beginning.
It seems so.
But before we jump into the revolution, it's worth pointing out that even before the war, Arnold was incredibly driven. He had an apothecary apprenticeship, served in the French and Indian War, and built a successful merchant career in the West Indies.
All of this before he even stepped foot on a revolutionary battlefield.
It's amazing.
What's fascinating here is that this early period reveals a man who wasn't content with mediocrity. He constantly sought new challenges, pushing himself to succeed in various fields. Some might call it restless ambition. Others might say it was a thirst for knowledge and experience.
And maybe, just maybe, it speaks to a need to prove himself, to silence those whispers of his family's decline that might have followed him from childhood.
It's a compelling theory, and it certainly adds another layer to our understanding of Arnold's character. This was a man driven by forces both internal and external. A man shaped by both personal ambition and the circumstances of his time.
All right, so the stage is set. We have a young Benedict Arnold, driven, ambitious, with perhaps a chip on his shoulder from his family's misfortunes, and then boom, the revolution breaks out.
This is where Arnold's story and the question of his true nature takes center stage.
One of the first events that really put him on the map was the capture of Fort Ticonderoga in 1775.
Yeah.
This was a major victory for the colonists, and it solidified Arnold's image as a bold and daring leader.
It's a pivotal moment in the early days of the war, and it's worth pausing here to consider the broader context. You have to remember that at this point, the Continental Army was still in its infancy. The idea of a unified force fighting for independence was still taking shape.
So you had these independent militias like Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys, who were fiercely independent and used to doing things their own way.
Exactly, and this clash of personalities between the more formally trained Arnold, who had an official commission from the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, and the charismatic Allen, who commanded the loyalty of his men, highlights the tensions that existed within the fledgling American forces.
The podcast describes this standoff so vividly, the Green Mountain Boys refusing to serve under anyone but Allen, stacking their muskets in defiance of Arnold's authority. It must have been a blow to his ego, especially after he had secured the official backing for the mission.
It speaks to a recurring theme in Arnold's life, this struggle for recognition, this need to prove his worth even when he held a position of authority. It also underscores the challenges of uniting a diverse group of people under a common cause, a challenge that would continue to plague the American leadership throughout the war.
In the end, Arnold had to agree to a joint command with Allen to capture the fort, a forced compromise, and I'm guessing not one that sat well with someone as ambitious as Arnold.
It's easy to see how this early experience might have fueled his resentment towards those in power, planting the seeds of discontent that would later blossom into full-blown rebellion.
And it wasn't long after this victory that personal tragedy struck again. His wife Margaret passed away in June of 1775, a devastating loss, and yet he threw himself even deeper into the war effort.
Was it dedication to the cause, a way to escape his grief, or maybe a combination of both? It's hard to say for sure, but it's clear that Arnold was driven by a complex mix of motivations, a mix that would become increasingly difficult to decipher as the war dragged on.
And his next major undertaking was the grueling expedition to Quebec.
Imagine marching 1,100 men through the Maine wilderness in the dead of winter, heavy snow, freezing temperatures, dwindling supplies. It's no wonder that roughly half of Arnold's troops either deserted, died, or fell ill during that trek.
It's difficult for us to even fathom that level of hardship today, and yet despite these challenges, Arnold and his remaining men reached Quebec and launched a daring assault on New Year's Eve in 1775.
The attack ultimately failed, and Arnold suffered a serious leg injury. But his superiors were deeply impressed by his bravery and perseverance. General Philip Schuyler even predicted that Arnold's march would be admired by historians for generations to come.
High praise indeed. Even George Washington recognized Arnold's grit and ability. He wasn't just some reckless hothead. He was a skilled tactician, a man who inspired his troops even in the face of incredible adversity.
It's crucial for us to remember this. At this stage in the war, Arnold was widely respected for his military skills and courage. He wasn't some incompetent soldier who stumbled into treason.
But as the war dragged on, things started to shift. Arnold felt increasingly overlooked and underappreciated despite his sacrifices and successes.
The seeds of discontent planted in those early years of hardship and fueled by a sense of injustice were beginning to sprout. And as we'll see, those seeds unfortunately would grow into something much more dangerous over time.
So we're at this point where Benedict Arnold has proven himself time and again on the battlefield. He's endured hardships, shown incredible bravery, and yet you can almost feel this undercurrent of frustration building. What happened? Was it a matter of personality, or were there legitimate grievances fueling this growing disillusionment with the Continental Congress?
It's a complex mix of both, and the podcast does a great job of highlighting the specific events that added fuel to this fire. For one, he was repeatedly passed over for promotions, even those military successes were undeniable. Imagine yourself in his shoes. You've risked your life, achieved victory against all odds, and yet you're constantly being overlooked.
Yeah, that's gotta sting, especially when you consider the political landscape at the time. Congress was struggling to manage a war effort on a shoestring budget, and there were constant power struggles between, various factions.
Exactly. And then there was the financial issue.
Yeah.
Arnold had poured a lot of his own money into equipping and supplying his troops, expecting to be reimbursed by Congress, but they were always strapped for cash and notoriously slow to repay their debts.
So he's not only risking his life, but he's also going broke in the process. That's a recipe for resentment, no matter how dedicated you are to the cause.
And let's not forget the physical toll the war was taking on him. Remember that leg injury he suffered at Quebec?
Oh, yeah.
Well, he was wounded multiple times throughout the war, including a devastating blow to that same leg during the pivotal Battle of Saratoga in 1777. This wasn't just a flesh wound. It was a constant reminder of the sacrifices he had made, sacrifices that seemed to be increasingly ignored by those in power.
You have to wonder, was there a point where his ambition, his desire for recognition started to morph into something more bitter, more resentful? The podcast hints at this idea that perhaps his ego made him oversensitive to these perceived slights.
It's a question that historians continue to grapple with. Was Arnold justified in feeling overlooked and underappreciated, or did his ego magnify these perceived injustices? It's difficult to separate the man from the myth, but it's clear that his psychological state was becoming increasingly fragile as the war dragged on.
And then comes his time in Philadelphia, where things really start to unravel in 1778 after the British evacuated the city. George Washington appointed Arnold as its military commander. This was supposed to be an honor, a recognition of his past service, but it seems to have had the opposite effect.
Here's where we see Arnold's complexities on full display. Instead of embracing a more austere lifestyle, befitting a wartime leader, he dives headfirst into Philadelphia's high society lavish parties, extravagant spending a fancy carriage.
Wow. While many Americans were struggling through wartime hardships, it's almost like he was rubbing their noses in it.
Exactly. And remember, this is a society steeped in Republican ideals, frugality, civic virtue, a rejection of aristocratic excess. Arnold's behavior directly contradicted these values.
Talk about a PR nightmare. It's no wonder that people started questioning his motives and loyalty.
And those whispers only grew louder when he began associating with loyalist sympathizers. This wasn't just about enjoying the finer things in life, it was about aligning himself with those who opposed the very cause he had fought for.
But was this a genuine shift in his allegiances, or was it a calculated move to further his own ambitions, regardless of which side came out on top?
It's a crucial question, and the podcast leaves it open for you to decide. Was he simply enjoying the spoils of war, or did he genuinely believe he deserved such rewards after all his sacrifices? His motivations become increasingly murky at this point.
And then there's Peggy Shippen, the young socialite he married in 1779. Her family had loyalist leanings, and this connection further tarnished his image in the eyes of many patriots.
It was seen as a betrayal of a cause, a confirmation of his shifting loyalties. But it's important to note that this period also saw Arnold clashing with a powerful political figure, Joseph Reed, who was the president of the Pennsylvania Executive Council.
Yeah, the podcast suggests that Reed had a personal vendetta against Arnold, accusing him of corruption and pursuing him relentlessly, often based on shaky evidence.
It's a fascinating dynamic. Was Reed motivated by genuine concerns about Arnold's conduct, or was this a power play, an attempt to discredit a rival? The podcast highlights Reed's animosity towards Arnold, suggesting it might have been fueled by political ambition or even a sense of moral righteousness. Whatever the reason, it added another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation.
So you have Arnold feeling increasingly alienated from both the military and political establishment, facing financial ruin, his reputation in tatters, and it's at this low point that he takes a drastic step, a step that would forever define his place in history.
He begins secretly communicating with the enemy, setting in motion the events that would lead to the infamous betrayal at West Point.
This is where the story takes a turn into full-blown espionage, secret meetings, coded messages, a high-stakes gamble that could have changed the course of the war.
It's a captivating tale of intrigue and betrayal, but it's also a story that forces us to confront the complexities of human nature. What drives a man to betray the cause he once fought for? Was it purely self-interest? Or was it something more nuanced, something more desperate?
That's the question we'll explore as we delve into the details of Arnold's plot to surrender West Point, a plot that would solidify his legacy as the ultimate American traitor. So Benedict Arnold is at this breaking point. He feels betrayed by the Congress, his reputation shot, and he's facing financial ruin. You can almost understand, even if you can't condone, how he might start to see the British side as his only way out.
It's that shift in perspective that's so fascinating. Arnold isn't just acting out of spite or greed.
Right.
He's convinced himself that the American cause is doomed. And in his mind, surrendering West Point becomes a way to save the colonies from further bloodshed and inevitable defeat.
So it's not just betrayal. It's almost like a twisted form of patriotism.
Exactly. He genuinely believed he was acting in the best interest of the people he was about to betray.
Wow.
It's a chilling example of how self-deception can warp even the most noble intentions.
And let's not forget the British were offering him a hefty reward, £20,000. That's a life-changing sum of money, especially for someone facing financial ruin.
Absolutely. It would be naive to ignore the financial motivations at play here. But the podcast emphasizes that for Arnold, it wasn't just about the money, it was about vindication. He wanted to prove his worth to the side he believed would ultimately prevail.
So he hatches this plan to hand over West Point, a strategically vital fort on the Hudson River. The podcast really lays out the stakes here. West Point controlled this key waterway, and its capture could have allowed the British to cut off New England from the rest of the colonies.
It would have been a major blow to the American war effort, potentially demoralizing the Continental Army and even swaying the French to withdraw their support. The British saw it as a potential turning point in the war.
And Arnold, as commander of West Point, was in the perfect position to make this happen. It's like something out of a spy thriller. Secret meetings with the British spy. John Andre coded messages, maps of the fort's defenses hidden in Andre's stockings.
It was a high-risk, high-reward operation, and for a while it seemed like Arnold might actually pull it off. He started subtly sabotaging the fort's defenses, neglecting repairs, repositioning troops. He was setting the stage for a British takeover without arousing too much suspicion.
But then fate intervened as Andre was making his way back to British lines. He was captured by American militiamen who discovered those incriminating documents hidden in his boots.
It's a moment of pure dramatic irony. The very act of concealing his treachery leads to its exposure, and for Arnold it was a sign that the game was up.
He made a daring escape to the British warship Vulture, leaving behind his wife, his newborn son, and the Americans who had once trusted him. Can you imagine the shock and betrayal that Washington and others must have felt?
The podcast captures that perfectly. Washington was reportedly devastated, asking, "Whom can we trust now?" It wasn't just the loss of a strategic fort, it was the shattering of trust, the realization that even those closest to the cause could turn against it.
So Arnold gets away with his life, but his reputation is forever tarnished. He becomes a brigadier general in the British Army, leads raids against American forces, even burning New London, Connecticut, a town not far from his birthplace.
It's almost as if he was trying to erase his past to prove his loyalty to his new masters by being even more ruthless toward his former countrymen. But despite his efforts, he never fully gained acceptance in British society.
Yeah, he's ostracized, viewed as a traitor by both sides. It's a tragic end for someone who started with so much promise.
He died a bitter and largely forgotten figure in 1801. But here's the twist. Even though Arnold committed a serious act of treason, his actions didn't have that devastating impact he and the British had hoped for.
That's right. The capture of Andre and the exposure of Arnold's plot actually ended up galvanizing American support for the war. It's like the ultimate backfire. His betrayal strengthened the very cause he was trying to undermine.
It's a testament to the resilience of the American spirit. Arnold's actions, instead of breaking their resolve, only fueled their determination to fight for independence.
So, in the grand scheme of things, Benedict Arnold ends up being a footnote in the American Revolution. But his name, of course, lives on in infamy.
He becomes a cautionary tale, a symbol of betrayal and the dangers of unchecked ambition. But as we've seen, he was also a complex figure, capable of great bravery and leadership, but ultimately driven to desperate measures by a combination of personal ambition, political maneuvering, and a sense of profound disillusionment.
It's a story that challenges us to think about how we judge historical figures. Do we focus solely on their actions, or do we try to understand the context, the pressures, the choices they
It
faced?
also raises questions about the nature of loyalty and betrayal. Where do we draw the line between patriotism and self-interest? Can good intentions ever justify treasonous acts?
These are questions that go far beyond Benedict Arnold and the American Revolution. They're questions that continue to resonate in our own time as we grapple with complex political landscapes, moral dilemmas, and the ever present tension between individual ambition and the greater good. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the life of Benedict Arnold. We hope it's left you with more questions than answers and a deeper appreciation for the complexities of history.